All right, not so obvious. Welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. I say I'm very well. I am incandescent with rage at the moment with regards to UK politics, but I'm sure we'll get into that. That's fine.
It's funny. This somewhat regularly happens where I will have interacted with someone on the internet enough that I just assumed I've had a conversation with them. And you and I did a space together where I realized I've never talked to you on my show before. And obviously, I'm happy to rectify that. I enjoy your commentary. You're a very astute political commentator. I enjoy your perspective. So I'm happy to have you on.
Very, very happy to be here. As I say, I've not interacted with you in an official capacity, but we obviously share spheres, we share spaces, so it's good. It's good to sit down and have a chat with you.
So I am, shall we say, an amateur appreciator of British politics. I get some, right? But I live 2,000 miles away. So there's only so much I can really get. So, briefly, if you could you describe the last election? Because I think that's an important kind of catalyst to what happened in the past few weeks.
So, if I'm going to dive into the election, forgive me for making a slight aside. You have to understand the a little bit of the history of the two sides involved: the Tory Party, the Conservatives, and the Labour Party, and the fact that there have been various usurpers to the throne of those two political parties, which, much like the Americans, I do think that the GOP and the Democrats are a little bit more distinct than Labour and Conservatives, but we've just been around much longer. But we still consider them, or at least on this side of politics, Labour and Conservative are relatively. At this stage, they're essentially the same party, and so you'll quite often hear people referring to them as the Uniparty. There are another small political group called the Liberal Democrats. They ran a coalition with the Conservative government from 2010, but it was a failed project for them because they were too small to affect any of the policies they ran on, and they lost the trust of the electorate, and they've never really recovered since. Meanwhile, you've got protest parties, which used to be BNP, which was the British National Party, which was associated with kind of white identitarianism, followed by UKIP, which was the UK Independence Party and centered almost entirely around leaving the European Union. And then now you've got the Brexit Party, which has turned into Reform UK, which is Nigel Farage's platform, Mr. Brexit's platform, and his job is to take a percentage of the vote. So uh, we've just come out of 15 years of or 14 years of the Tories, the Conservatives running the country. They have essentially done every single policy decision they've made has been in favour of the uniparty's position on things, which means it's moving leftward. And really, it continues to move leftward right now. But the Tories' pursuit of leftist policies have destroyed the country in such a way and been so anti manufacturing, anti production, anti economy, pro tax, pro large scale international globalist projects that. And definitely pro immigration, which has led to the complete collapse of support for the Conservative Party. That's what's interesting about the general election that's just happened, because the Labour Party have come in with a majority of the electoral vote. Sure, I say a majority. It's not the popular majority, but it's the majority under our first past the post system. And the reality of that is that means that voter turnout was the lowest that it's been in a very, very long time. I believe since 1978, but don't quote me on that. Um, and so, as a percentage of the electorate. So, what's happened is they've come in with less votes than they got in the last general election, where they lost and yet still won the government because collapse of the Tory support has been so absolute. It is not that voters have switched from one side of the uniparty to the other. People hate the Tories so much in this country that they just didn't turn out. And if they did turn out, they voted Reform, which is Nigel Farage's platform, which led to them getting, I believe, five councillors. It were five ministers in the end, and or they voted independent. So there were now a number of independent candidates seated in the government, which are um, almost unanimously pro Gaza, and they ran on a pro Gaza platform, sort of free Palestine platform in majority Muslim areas. So that's just a bit of background on the current state of sort of the direct aftermath of the election. So what happened in that election, and why it happened, basically. Um, if your question hasn't got lost in there, I'm afraid.
So one thing that I think is worth discussing is what is the sort of the establishment party in the UK. In the US, it's very easy to ascertain that the Democrats are the party of power, right? The Republicans are sort of this secondary party that doesn't really exist to rule as much as to kind of bilk money out of their base. Is there something similar going on in the UK, or is it a different arrangement?
I would say it's a different arrangement. Happy to be challenged on this by anyone who has their eyes on the actual funding procedures. But the way I understand it is that the Labour Party and the Tory Party are the establishment parties, and they've basically flip flopped between these for nearly 100 years now. Um, there was another party before Labour called the Liberal Party, but that's way back. And the funding mechanism for these parties is through donors. So there are rich donors that come in, a mixture between kind of corporate donors and private individuals, although I believe it's mostly private individuals. There are some strict regulations on how much kind of corporate entities can give to parties. But that's essentially the system, but it's not about funneling money out their user base. In fact, memberships of both parties, the Labour and the Conservatives, have been cratering um, for some time, to the point where in the last election, the Tories wanted to run marketing campaigns, and they worked out that they didn't have enough money to effectively campaign, which has never happened in the history of their organisation. That's kind of mental. Um, as for when they're in power, they tend to get their financing from government projects, handing projects to sort of within their sphere, handing the projects out. And there are also a couple of major government contractor players who also are involved there. So one of the big ones is Serco. So when the COVID-19 pandemic came around, Serco was the company that administered all of the vaccine centres basically across the country, and they also have a hand in private security for, or yeah, private security for places like Dover, which is one of the key crossing ports between us and the continent, and various other projects all over the shop. They're heavily entrenched in the Home Office, which is the political office which manages all affairs domestically, if that makes sense. So there you go.
So we spoke about uh, the conditions of this election, and obviously, the election is not the most dramatic thing to happen in the last few months. It was certainly significant, right? But there were recently some race riots in the UK. Do you want to speak to the circumstances surrounding those?
So I will be cautious here because the government of my country is very keen to crack down on what it perceives as mis or disinformation. So I will preface this by saying everything here is my own opinion, and don't take any of it as sort of gospel truth, as it were. Please do your own research and find trusted sources if you want to collaborate it. That being said, the way that I perceive what has happened on the ground is There were three. There was a dance class in a town called Southport, and at that dance class, there was a mass stabbing by a the son of Rwandan immigrants. His name can't remember off the top of my head, and I won't try and pronounce it. But he went in, stabbed a number of girls. I believe it was 18 of them, and three of them died of their injuries. In the direct aftermath of this, what appears to have been linked to a Pakistani sort of digital presence leaked information that a Muslim was the perpetrator, because our government is very, very, despite the fact that when someone is arrested, they usually quite quickly release descriptions of individuals, certainly if they're a native. They don't do that if it's someone who is in a protected characteristic. So there was a lot of confusion about who actually perpetrated this, and this led to a protest, which then turned into a riot outside of a mosque in Southport. Now, initially, the media tried to push this off as the far right, an organization called the English Defence League, or the EDL, that had bussed in rioters to cause trouble and take advantage of a grievous situation in order to basically attack a mosque. The reality of the arrests that happened in the aftermath of that riot show that almost everyone who is arrested is from the local area. In fact, I haven't seen a single arrest that was from further than 5 miles outside of the area. Couple that with the fact that the English Defence League was officially disbanded in 2013, so it doesn't exist. It's not an organisation that exists in any capacity in this country. Um, and really, there's a lot of misinformation floating around. There was also a claim that a man wielding a machete came out when they were protesting outside the mosque and attacked people in the crowd and then fled into the mosque. As far as I can tell, that's not true. Haven't seen any video evidence, any photo evidence. No one's come forward and given an interview. As far as I can tell, that's nothing. But the final result of that was the wall outside the mosque was damaged, and there was a police car lit on fire, and I believe 37 police officers were injured, which is quite a high level of violence for UK. Um, Now, directly after this event, the media came out in storm in defence of quote unquote our communities, and that being the Muslim community that they were defending. And the government, in particular the prime minister, made two speeches. The first speech he gave was in defense of those communities and saying that he would crack down on the rioters with the full force of the law. And then the second one was basically the same effect. And he took questions afterwards, and he basically played the fiddle for all of the minority communities in the UK and did not address in any way the native concern, did not address the reason for the protests and the resulting riot in the first place was that people were angry about the stabbings. In no way did he signal that he was in control of the situation, and so on. In fact, what happened was a list was proliferated throughout the internet, something which Hope Not Hates leader um, Mr. Knowles has suggested is a hoax that was deliberately leaked in order to try and ferret out far right sentiment in the UK, and 100 locations were leaked. So this led the media to go on a craze where it determined that there are 100 locations. The far right's going to attack a huge number of migrant hotels and other sort of immigrant centers, and yeah, like they're going to come out. We're going to put a huge police force out there, and we're going to defend against them. In the run up to these planned 100 protests, there were a couple of other protests, a couple of other riots, one in Bolton and one in Birmingham, I believe, both of which were attended by sort of agitators, as you were, sort of native agitators, I will say. So working class white Brits, guys who are still being charged over these events, and Also counter protested by a number of groups, notably Muslims, who were seen openly carrying weapons, not firearms, but machetes, bats, and various clubs and things of that nature. So there was then no police response to this, and in fact, there was a video which was leaked which showed police officers speaking to the migrants, saying, "We're on your side." I call them migrants, minorities is probably just more accurate. Um, Speaking to them and saying, "We're on your side. We're on your side." There was another report, although I haven't been able to substantiate it, that one of them also told a minority carrying a weapon to put the weapon in the car, put the weapon back in your car, and then go protest over there. There was no no charges were brought against the fact that he was carrying a weapon with clear intent to use it in public. So uh, there was the state of the UK. There was a high state of tension, and really, me and a number of other political commentators who are familiar with the players that are around the UK, and especially in terms of distant right thought, are thinking, we've had no information about any of these 100 riot locations that have been leaked. There are no people that we're aware of that are planning these, and as proponents generally of elite theory, um, we thought, where's the organized minority in this? It's not TR, I will say, just because YouTube doesn't like his name. It's not a number of other agitators. So who is it? Who's running these? I refuse to believe that it's all sort of bottom up Facebook organized riots, and also that social media wouldn't immediately clamp down on these groups and take into custody the people who are running them. What you would see if there was a legitimate 100 riots that were going to go on would be a series of police raids on the supposed leaders of these riots, the people who had organised them, in order to try, kind of take momentum out of the sales of the thing. And we didn't see that. And lo and behold, the riot day happened, and almost no one turned up, except a whole bunch of counter protesters, quote unquote counter protesters, all very well funded, all carrying exactly the same coloured placards and banners that had all been printed out. A lot of them who had basically they got a lot of their generic slogans on there. So their stand up to racism is the main one, and they had a number of things on there, anti TR and stop Farage and sort of pro European propaganda and so on. So those people turned out en masse, and then the media covered that and said, "Oh, isn't this wonderful? The entire nation has united against hate." Especially, and they brought particular attention to Birmingham and uh, Brighton, Brighton being the gay capital of the UK, where there would absolutely be no riot anyway, even if riots were to take place. So they purposefully left out Croydon, interestingly, which was where the counter protesters turned up. There was no one to demonstrate against, so they smashed up a street anyway. About 50 people. The media then ran cover for them and said they weren't affiliated with the protest, even though realistically they probably were. So probably to anyone who's listening. So there you go.
So what has
Sorry, that's a
been
lot of information there.
no, no, it's helpful. What has been the government's response to these rioters, right? We support every rightfully elected government and take their opinions very seriously, of course. So these rioters, right, were I assume, prosecuted. And how does that compare to the way that other criminals, particularly violent criminals in the UK, how are they treated?
So you have to understand that the UK judiciary is suffering a massive backlog at the moment. Um, Wait times for court cases are very, very long and can take a very long time. Um, you're not talking 3 months here; it might be 3 years before you get someone to a trial. And essentially, Starmer, who's the prime minister, said we're going to run 24-hour courts. We're going to immediately push these people, these far right thugs, he referred to them as, to the front of the queue, and we're going to produce harsh sentencing on them and put them in prison. There was one issue with that. One of the issues is the prisons are overcrowded, and they have been overcrowded for nearly 20 years, and there weren't enough spaces for people. So they enacted a plan that they were already implementing, which was to release a number of criminals back into society. And there was a lot of talk, oh, it's not going to be violent criminals, it's just going to be people who are on minor offenses, who have long sentences, but we don't really do that anymore. Think people who are arrested for drug possession and things like that, but not necessarily intent to distribute. And the reality was that they released a number of people, including murderers who had only served 8 months of their sentence. And regardless of whether or not it was just good timing, so to speak, and they were always going to be released, I think the idea that our government would release someone who killed a 14-year-old, um, after 8 months in custody is absurd, in to the nth degree, just to make room for someone who, basically, for instance, as we saw a couple of days ago, was waving a flag at a protest and didn't take part in any violence and was simply chanting "Whose streets? Our streets," for instance. So um, these protesters have been sentenced very harshly, as I said. Some of them have been sentenced by up to 2 years in prison for, at the taxpayer's expense. By the way, it's £50,000 a year to have a prisoner in there, and you're hire, you're sending in native kids who have got fired up, but haven't really caused any damage or harm. And then similarly, you've also got the other part of it, which is that in our prisons there is a large contingent of Asian gangs. I am saying Asian gangs because that's how the Met Police describe it. And one of their commissioners said that the protesters can expect a very cold welcome from those groups in prison. A few years ago, TR was put in a prison, and they had to put him in solitary confinement because he was at risk of the prisoners basically killing him, and they were pushing excrement through his door. I believe was reported at the time, and very similarly as well, a man, forgive me, I can't remember his name, was arrested for and sentenced for putting a piece of bacon on a mosque's front porch, and 6 months into his sentence, he was killed. So there's really only one way that I can take the statement that there's going to be a very cold reception for these protesters, which is that they're at high risk of violence and potentially death when they're in the system, which seems like a cruel and unusual punishment for someone who has waved a flag at a protest against the stabbings of three girls. So there you go.
What degree is the government interested in prosecuting people who didn't even show up? They just may have voiced their concern over social media. I know you alluded to that earlier, and I understand that you have to be circumspect. So don't do anything legally unadvisable. But can you speak to that?
As I say, I don't think I'm particularly at risk because I'm only stating facts, and a lot of what I'm saying is coming out of the mainstream media. It's just my take on that. Again, it's just my opinion, and I'm not fomenting any kind of misinformation or disinformation. We have a piece of legislation in this country called the Communications Act, which was brought in 2003, and you may remember way back in 2003, the internet was developing, but it wasn't what it is today. Social media certainly wasn't what it is today, didn't exist. So there was a section 127 of the Communications Act, which is the article which dictates that it is illegal to distribute a grossly offensive message with the intent to cause distress over a public communication system, and that is was basically brought in to prevent phone should I call them, sort of like stalkery types, heavy breathing down the phone or constantly calling someone up and harassing them and being obscene. In the wake of the internet, it has been used to prosecute people who post Facebook messages or other social media messages that the state doesn't agree with. And the state will also pursue cases against people even if no one has been offended. So the whole piece of legislation hinges on a piece of grossly offensive information being transmitted. However, as we saw in a case of Mark Meakin, aka Count Dankula, who posted a joke about a Nazi pug, they will prosecute you even if no one has been offended, because they will hunt out someone and say, Are you offended by this?" and shove it in their face, even if they're not the intended target audience, even if they never saw it, even if no one of that demographic has complained before, and they'll go, "Yeah, that's offensive," and then they prosecute him. He wanted to go to prison to prove a point, but they fined him £800 and took it directly out of his bank account. So you can't even go to prison as a protest now in this country. They will just start sentencing you. Now, are the messages that people have been prosecuted for in this country things that I would have said? No. But do I think they're tantamount to incitement to violence? Do I think that they are um, grossly offensive when people have either not complained about them, or the number of people complaining about them is so minor that it may as well be a personal dispute between two people? No. There was a chap who was imprisoned for commenting underneath footage of the riots, filthy bastards, and then a picture of a brown emoji and a gun emoji. Okay, so that. I reckon it's the emojis, not the text, that's got him in trouble with the law there. Um, but someone else posted I believe, a comment. I don't know the exact text of the comment, but he posted something regarding the riots on Facebook, and then that post was only to his friends, so it was not never going to proliferate outside of the circle of whatever 100, 200 people that he was, friends with on social media, and they still sent him down, I believe, for 18 months, but don't quote me on that. Because they said it was offensive, and he had deleted that post. Sorry, he didn't delete that post. A woman also posted something, then deleted the post, and they still, got her over it. I don't know what she was sentenced to. So this is the sort of the levels that we're dealing with here. Nobody is sure of the limits of this because it's so subjective. And But what we do know is who's being targeted, specifically who's being targeted and who's not being targeted, because as we know, if the government took hate speech and hate crime seriously, all of the algorithmic data, Facebook, for instance, uses a race blind algorithm, and they had to adjust it because the amount of anti-white slurs, that's their own words, by the way. I'm an Englishman. I'm not a white identitarian. Um, the amount of anti-white hate dwarfed any hatred towards minorities. I believe they said it was 80%. So it's a very one-sided prosecution system. I don't believe any minority has ever been prosecuted under it, and that's where we're at, and that's their response to things.
So, to what degree have these stabbings become normalized? I I
I
watched a
would.
horrific video very recently. You've no doubt seen it, of a guy pushing a baby stroller who's stabbed in the neck. And obviously, it's bereft of context. I don't know why it happened, but it seems to me, from the outside looking in, that England didn't used to have this problem. It seems to be a relatively new phenomenon.
My perception, and I'm gonna again highlighted is my perception of that clip is that his presumed wife and child were being harassed. He turned around to tell them to go away, and then they stabbed him in the neck. He did survive. He is in hospital, and the perpetrator has been arrested. But I was looking into this. There have been 4.5 stabbings per day across the entire UK, from the period March 2023 to 24, and 4.5 murders per week that have resulted from that. So that's around 2,000 stabbings and 233 murders for the last period. However, there's been a huge amount of media attention and private attention, I would say, on stabbings, which has just arisen almost out of nowhere, I would say, in the last week. And I think it's because it's either that there's a particular interest in knife crime at the moment, and so people are hypersensitive to it, and it's getting proliferated a lot more, or there's a concerted effort by the media for clicks, basically, because stabbings are what's driving engagement. And I do believe that most media organisations in the UK have abandoned their purpose in favor of the engagement bait, in favor of the clickbait, and the fact that the more if it bleeds, it sells basically. So they want the comments, they want the rage, they want the hate, because that's their entire funding mechanism, right? Even the BBC, I'm sure, supplements its income through that in some way, but that's just speculation on my part. Um, I have looked at things and I go, well, obviously the data set that I've just quoted doesn't include the last 5 months. However, I would not be surprised if the number of stabbings has increased dramatically over that period. Really, there's been a lot of excuse me, counter posting, which says that actually, if you compare the UK, especially London, to US cities, then the murder rate and the knife crime rate is lower. However, I am not interested in comparing us to another country with a different set of customs and a different set of people and different numbers of people. I'm interested in comparing it to our historical norms and our historical values, and we have not had crime on this level for a very long time. In fact, when I believe it was 2011, but it might have been earlier, there was a change to the way crime was recorded. So it's actually very difficult to get eyes on these stats except through third party organizations, some of whom have questionable data collection methods. So the closest we've got is the Office for National Statistics, and what they choose to release is also interesting to note. But there you go.
On that note, I mean, if you're comparing to certain US cities, right, St. Louis is roughly as dangerous as Caracas, right? Like it's sort of a useless comparison. It's like, oh, well, it's not nearly as bad as one of the top 10 most dangerous cities in the world. Like, oh, okay, like that's in no way a useful comparison. I think that as an outsider, right, looking in, the thing that just genuinely completely gobsmacks me is the fact that you do have this, let's just say, a relative rise in violent crime. And the response is, well, we need to free up some space in our prisons, so we'll let 5,000 prisoners go. In their place, we will prosecute anything from people who got out of hand and clashed with the police to people who make comments on the internet or wave flags. And not only will we do that, will we swap one out for the other, but it might take a year or two for your knife criminal to get tried. But if it's your grandma posting something unwise on Facebook, well, we can get her booked in what 3-4 days. It's the same sort
Yeah,
of a
well,
narco tyranny you see in the U.S. Just very very clearly.
none of the sentencing that's been going on has been jury trial. That's the main thing, and I think that's one of the reasons why we're going to see, much like January 6th over in the US, continuing sort of spat or spate of of sentencing and prosecution. At the moment, what we're seeing is the people who have presumably under duress um, pled guilty, and so have gone straight before a judge, and then a judge has sentenced them. Interestingly, someone compiled a thread of those judges and their summary judgments, particularly against, um, shall we say, people who uh, like 'em young. I'm going to say that to try and avoid you being demonetized. But essentially, they were letting people go because they quote unquote show remorse or whatever. So there's a thing. Well, you'll get 20 to 21 months if you waved a flag at a rally, or you threw a brick at police, or you will get a suspended sentence or no sentence at all if you had 64,000 indecent images on your hard drive, but you felt remorseful. So there's a lot of two-tierism when it comes to the British state and its allocation of justice with regards to this. But I expect that there will be people who are more happy and willing to challenge the prosecution against them. But because the system is so delayed, we're not going to see the results of that until for a number of years. And I'm sure that's what the defense lawyers are saying when they assigned to these working class lads who are just sitting there and being told it's going to be 2 years to a trial during which you'll be in custody because no bail for you. Um, then once you have your trial, they're going to try and get the maximum sentence because you're involved in this. So you're going to go to prison for 3 years. If you just plead guilty now, we'll have you in court and out again. So tomorrow, and then you'll be out of prison in 8 months or whatever. They'll sentence you to 20 months, and you'll be out in 8 months. So that is what I assume is going on. Again, just my opinion. I'm not a legal expert and would never claim to be, but that feels like what's going on. Which, yeah, that's whataboutism. But I expect that the Free Speech Union, for instance, I would hope is getting involved in a number of these cases, and helping people.
So we spoke to the situations that allowed labor to take power in sort of a dramatic fashion, right? I've spoken before about the zero seats movement, which was a group of right-leaning voters who were completely and totally fed up with the Conservative Party and decided to punish them by giving them as few seats as possible. And so it seems like Labor didn't win as much as the Conservatives lost. So how has
Uh,
this affected? Sorry, the how has this affected the view of Keir Starmer and the Labour Party? How has this affected their mandate, so to speak?
well, as our friend in common, the academic agent, would say, it's he should have been a boring bank manager. He should have been a managerialist. He should have simply filled in the potholes, said we've got it all under control, and that anyone and been open-handed, fair-handed about it. The whole thing. Instead, he's pursued this very one-sided vendetta against the rioters, and then he has tried to go back to that managerial sort of position. However, he is now incredibly unpopular. um, Now, there is a mechanism for exchanging prime ministers in this country. It doesn't trigger a general election. It doesn't mean that then we have to rerun the numbers or anything. The internal party mechanisms within the Labour Party would elect a new prime minister after Keir Starmer would be, shall we say, encouraged to step down of his own volition, or a vote of no confidence would be made in him um, to do it. Uh, he almost, if he almost had the opportunity to step down and have the shortest run as prime minister, a title which was only previously held recently by Liz Truss, who was very very briefly prime minister of the country under the Tories. So He didn't do that, but it would have been funny if he did. So I don't know how long he'll last. He could hold on. As far as I can tell, in normie sphere, people have bought the line that it was the far right and they're bad, and the counter protest was a united Britain. So whilst we in the politically active side of things can sometimes have a skewed view where we believe that, well, actually he's really unpopular for XYZ reason. But the reality is they don't care enough about the people who care, basically, enough to do it. They go, well, we've got 5 years to recover his reputation or whatever, and the normies can always be brought back around. I think that's realistically he is done. But I also think that he could just run out this term. Then they change the guard sort of a year before election, and then the new prime minister has a chance to turn it around in terms of their opinion. So it could go either way, really.
So it does it seem like the unrest is done? Has this successfully been memory hold, or is it still an active story?
Well, as I said, the actual roots of quote unquote far right movement in this country don't exist. So the riots were deliberately a response. The first set of riots, certainly. I can't speak to the two riots that happened afterwards, but the first set of riots was definitely, in my opinion, connected to the the murder of the three girls. And the fact that the government hasn't addressed that at all, the only reason it's still in as a talking point, and again, I don't think it's really a talking point in the mainstream media, but the only reason it's a talking point for us is because we're just seeing another story about another stabbing. Germany Diversity Festival, 3 people stabbed. Notting Hill Carnival is coming up here in London. Last year, there were 300 and something arrests for disorderly conduct, and 8 people were stabbed. Um, you know, these sorts of events are kind of keeping it alive. But in terms of actual people, unfortunately, and the reason why me and a number of other commentators recommended that we didn't involve ourselves in any way with these riots. First of all, we thought it was a psyop anyway. But even if you did have a grassroots riot or protest near you, we said don't get involved, because in 2 3 weeks time this will be out of the public consciousness and it'll be out of mainstream media talking points. But you're still going to go through the hell of the legal system and all the consequences of that, um, as a result. So what I think it's being kept alive by Twitter. I think it's being kept alive by mainstream reporting on stabbings at the moment. But in terms of an actual grassroots right wing movement in the UK, it doesn't exist. It's one of the things that I noted. I tweeted out about this and said essentially, that the government crackdown will just work in this country because there's a disorganized mass. Someone doesn't have a standing army ready to defend people. There's no legal framework with a series of networked sort of legal firms who say, well, we're going to defend these rioters. We think they're justified. There's no foot soldiers who are willing to continue the fight if one of their groups gets taken down. There's no one who's willing to march on Westminster and enact a coup, right? So there's no one on the right who's willing or able or funded to capitalize on the moment, and there's no one, there's no greater hive mind sitting there and thinking about it enough to plan moves and protect people. So it's just a disorganized mass, and disorganized masses are easily dealt with and dissipate easily as well, unfortunately.
So to what degree is labor solving other problems? Because one of the things that our academic agent predicted was that labor is much more likely to solve certain acute problems. And all right, so he made that prediction, but I saw an article today that basically said that labor has conducted one of the largest deportations in recent history. Do you see that as being likely, or is that just me getting got by
Oh
a
my
headline?
goodness. The largest deportation, the largest deportation for like 20 years or whatever. Do you know how many people that is, Mr. Burton? Do you know how many people?
Ah, I hesitate to guess. I'm guessing it's nowhere near as large as I'd like to believe.
It's 200.
200 is that is not a lot of people. That is that's so
All right.
depressing.
Again, just for context, more people arrived by boat illegally across the channel on Monday last week than were deported yesterday. So, 200, there's a number of people who are going, oh, look at this, celebrate this. All the conservative talking heads are going, or I say conservative with a small c there. The right wing talking heads are going, oh, look at this, Labour's doing something based. And I'm like, call me when it's 2,000, call me when it's 20,000. We have 10,000 foreign prisoners, so to speak, like directly foreign prisoners with no citizenship, I believe I read on the BBC, in prison that need to be deported. And that's taking a long time, or it's not on the agenda, or whatever. So that would be a good start. And then you can follow up with, sort of, if you're going to make summary judgments against people with dual citizenship, revocation of citizenship, a la Shamima Begum, um, in the same vein as Shamima Begum, would be the good thing. So Shamima Begum, just for quick context, was a teenage girl who went off to join ISIS um, with three friends, and then decided she wanted to come back. The UK revoked her citizenship. She appealed it, and that appeal was denied. So there was a big international hullabaloo about that, where they wanted to know whether or not she could be legally, according to international law, made stateless, or what country would take her. So, because they didn't want to recognize ISIS as a legitimate state, right? So, um, and then all questions about her grooming. Anyway, because she was 15, the there is precedent to revoke people's citizenship, especially dual citizenship. Um, Personally, I'm against the concept of dual citizenship outside of the union. You could be English slash Scottish, English slash Irish, English slash Welsh, or any combination therein of the host nations. I'm just using English there because I'm English, and that's fine by me. But when you start then extrapolating that out to other nations, I just no, just no. It's one of the few things I think China gets right and America gets right on citizenship. Anyway, um, yeah. So I would say that the any deportation rhetoric that you see being talked up that doesn't mention the raw numbers, really distrust. Dig into that, and you will see, as you say, they go, oh, they're celebrating that they've managed to get 200 people away. It's like, man, our net immigration figures for last year was like 1.3 million. you know, um, and even if they're just talking about illegals, there were 11,000 illegals that came last year, I believe. It might be more, might be 13,000. So again, don't quote me on that. But there are large numbers of illegals, and you were telling me you deported 200 of them. Like, that's a drop in the ocean, man. That's a single gumball in the gumball machine. Doesn't make any sense to me.
So I feel like we've covered the reasons, but at the beginning, you said you were incredibly despondent about British politics. Uh, Why?
Um, I wouldn't say despondent. Despondent's the wrong word. I am uh, of the belief that very few people are willing or able to build a genuine quote unquote resistance um, in this country. Partly because people just refuse to be aware of how bad things currently are, and the only way that they'll do that is through experience. So you can convince people into becoming a leftist. There's various logical traps. There's lots of stuff which sounds good on paper. There's lots of calling to universal humanity and stuff like that. However, the right is built predominantly on lived experience. It's built predominantly on um, understanding things on a fundamental level, through deep research and more than surface level arguments. So there are very few people who are willing to go that far, or have the time to go that far, or have the means to go that far. And again, I am someone who has built a couple of organizations on nominally on the right, um, over the last 8 years, and both of them are, well, one of them collapsed eventually after I left, because they didn't continue to grow. Um, I'm always a fan. If you're not growing, you're shrinking, um, when it comes to organization, and it's very hard to find competent people. It's very hard to find egos that you're not going to clash with, but also are going to provide enough kind of commentary and flavor and competence to make things work. So you can fall into fighting very easily. And then other than that, it's just people don't know what to do. They're tired. We're a very densely populated country, but we're all split up and fragmented across the nation. So it's really hard to centralize an effort in any one area, and the internet's not really a place for it. Um, I am a fan of a statement. You've got to create a reality on the ground that no one can deny. So, whilst a lot of people are like, well, we need to get approval for this, that, and the other, or do something like I'd rather ask for forgiveness than ask for permission. But getting people to agree on what we should do, and then getting them to a place, like physically locating them in a place where we can actually do stuff, is really difficult. I have been looking at local government. I've been considering running for the mayor of my town. No one in our sphere lives anywhere near me, as far as I can tell. There's a few people who have turned up to a TR rally. There are a few people who I know are familiar with the work of people like the Lotus Eaters, but none of them are foot soldiers. None of them are, um, sort of anything more than just sort of observers in the current game that we're playing. And that might make me sound a bit depressed, but I'm not. I think that I will eventually find it and find the right group of people. It'll probably be London, to be honest, just because it's the most interconnected place. But London's expensive to live in, so we all need ways to fund getting projects off the ground there, and so on. Um, yeah, it's also a big battleground at the moment. Really, it's the heart of the nation, whether people like it or not. And yeah, that's where we're at.
So what are your predictions for the next several years? What trends do you think will continue? What new forces do you think will become players in the game going forward?
Okay, this is an interesting question to me, but I'm hesitant to make many predictions. But I am also interested in coming back to this video in 2 years and seeing whether or not I'm completely full of it or not. Um, I think the interesting thing to observe is going to be Reform UK, and that's going to be predicated on a couple of factors. One, whether or not Nigel Farage steps up into a statesman-like position and is able to capitalize on his position as an MP, because that's the thing that's new. He's always been on the outside. He's never won his seat before. He was a member of the European Parliament, but not a member of the UK Parliament, for several years, and now he's on the inside. Now he can directly speak to power. Now he has a lot of eyes on him, and if he's able to capitalize on that, then I think that he can take the party far. But it's also dependent on what happens with Reform UK. So Reform UK is structured not as a political party, but as a limited company. Farage's previous endeavor as head of UKIP was frustrated, he says, because of the party apparatus, essentially having to have like a mini cabinet committee that runs the whole thing, and so there's a lot of democracy inherent in starting a political party, and he found that very frustrating to deal with when he wanted to run the show, basically. Um, and whether or not Reform UK survives a transition to that form of governance is going to be an interesting thing. whether or not they merge with the remnants of the Tory party, whether or not the Tory party can regain favour. They're like the snake that won't die, the Hydra, where you've cut off 8 of its heads, but there's still one left, and now the second head is growing back again. So I don't know who they could front because the country seems to have lost faith in their previous, certainly not Rishi Sunak, but the previous popular leader, Boris Johnson, is not very popular at the moment with the British public, but a lot can change in 5 years. Um, in terms of Labour and its decisions, even if it did nothing else for the next 4 years except fill in potholes, I think there'd still been a huge issue because the Labour base is feeling betrayed because taxes are going up and taxes are going up specifically in places where they said before the election they wouldn't. So pensioners, for instance, have got these higher prices for this winter, and everyone's talking about that at the moment in normie sphere. Similarly, the what you call it, the millionaires crisis is going to come. So there are 47% of UK millionaires who say that they're considering leaving the UK over big tax hikes for them. Given that our millionaires pay 30% of all the tax in the country, and that we're currently running a massive deficit, and that Labour want to bring in more taxes, and that Labour want to produce more programs, this is a big issue, even though the left are currently mocking it, particularly in social media. Do I think 47% of UK millionaires will leave? The ones who have the means and their businesses are, liquid enough that they can move abroad, um, probably will. But people always like their creature comforts and their home comforts, and it's still their country. So a good chunk of them will probably stick around, even if they're grumbling about it. But even if it's only a quarter of that, that's still losing a huge chunk of revenue. Um, a huge chunk of revenue from the tax pocket, which is then going to have to come out of taxpayers' wallets instead. So it could be that Labour go on a downward spiral with regards to that as well. I'm sorry that none of those predictions are particularly concrete, but those are the things that I'm keeping an eye on basically over the next few years.
Look, you're talking to someone who is absolutely convinced there was no way Vladimir Putin would invade Ukraine. So you will never get flack from me for making a bad prediction because that was one of those ones where I was like, all right, I may have to retire from the prediction game. But I know we should have probably discussed this earlier, but if people want to find more of your work, what's the best way for them to do that?
At the moment, it's best to find me on Twitter or X. My DMs are always open. It's always interesting to receive messages from people. That's at not underscore so underscore obvious. Yes, it's a bit of a mouthful, but it's fairly easy to find me. I may also be going on the Lotus Eaters. You can find some of my written work on there under articles under my written name there, which is Mark Houghton.
Well, again, man, thank you so much for coming on. This was personally very helpful as you can sort of get a distorted view of another country's politics on the internet. And so this has been very informative for me.
Well, I hope that it has been informative and that I haven't distorted things too much either.
Well, again, man, thank you so much for coming on. It was a good conversation. As far as my stuff, you can find the Jay Burden Show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. I've received a flood of new reviews, which I highly, highly appreciate. Obviously, it doesn't cost you anything, but it makes me laugh, and that's a good way to support the show. Another way is to head over to Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. JD is very, very good at what he does, and I was just in the gym before recording this, and let me tell you, he is very good at making you suffer. So if it sounds like you need that, head over to Axios. Again, not so obvious. Thanks for coming on. And everyone at home, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night.